Hello, my name is Christina. Welcome to my new channel where I talk about books. I've always been obsessed with books, forever. I'm not the fastest reader, but I am always reading, and I went to college for English literature, and a big part of that was reading and discussing books, and I really miss that. And I have been watching a lot of booktube videos lately, and it's just all people like talking about books that they love, and I wanted to get in on that. So welcome, this is a new channel where I'll be talking about books. I thought a good way to get started would be to talk about my favorite books of all time, and then my favorite books so far this year. The year is almost over, so it'll probably be, my favorite books of the year, but there are a couple weeks left, so who knows, maybe I'll find one that I love, and then I'll have to tell you about that later. But my favorite books have always been fantasy and anything medieval, so that's basically what I'll be talking about. I do also listen to a lot of audiobooks that are like thrillers or psychological or crime related, but they don't tend to be my favorite. It's almost like a soap opera sort of thing where it's like I watch it and it's like a guilty pleasure, but it's never like my favorite. The ones that really stay with me. In fact, I was looking at my list of things, of books that I listened to this year to pick out my favorites, and most of the psychological or like crime thrillers that I listened to, I enjoyed them, but I couldn't remember any of them. They just sort of all blend together. But so I will start with that. Okay, so now we'll get into my top 5 favorite all-time books. I thought this was a good way to introduce myself, but also a good way for you to know that if our tastes match. So if you want to take recommendations from me, will it make sense? Maybe the books that I love you hate, and so it doesn't make sense at all. So I think this is a good way to know that. That being said, there are several booktuber book channels that I watch that have very different tastes in books from me, and I just watch it because I enjoy it. So if you want to do that, that's totally cool with me. But I do think when it comes to taking book recommendations, you want to know what somebody's tastes are like, and if you love the books that they love, then you can take their recommendations to heart. But so, I am going to start off with, let's see, these are my top 5 books of all time. I don't have them really in a specific order because it's very hard for me to decide that. I will say that this first book, Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, this was the book that really inspired my love of medieval fiction. So there was a point in my life where I really wanted to read fantasy, and I was looking for a fantasy book to read and I couldn't find anything, and I remember thinking to myself, I want a fantasy book that just doesn't have all the nonsense, which maybe that doesn't make any sense, but basically in my mind I was I wanted the medieval theme without all the aspects of the world building and the magic systems and all that. I just wanted a story that was really in depth with the characters, and that's what this is. Essentially, it's basically a fantasy novel. You get that medieval setting, but there's no magic. That sounds really dumb, but that's sort of how I came to love medieval fiction, and I read so much of it now. And this book, Ken Follett, I've read so many of his books now, but he is just a master of character writing, and this book sort of amazed me because it goes so in-depth into characters, and the whole book is basically about building a church. And my boyfriend made a lot of fun of me for reading Ken Follett novels because this one is about building a church, the next one is about building a bridge, and it's just about people's sort of mundane lives as they go about doing these very normal tasks, but it's so good and it's riveting, and you'll want to know what happens to the characters, and you want to find out everything about them. You want to know how their lives are and what happens to them, and it's so good. And so if anyone is looking to get into medieval fiction, or they're like me where you're in a rut with fantasy and you want that sort of fantasy world sort of feeling without all of the extra stuff. You just really want really good characters. That's how I feel about this. So definitely 10 out of 10, Pillars of the Earth. I love Ken Follett. There he is. You will definitely hear me talk about other Ken Follett novels in the future. I still have some to read. I still am planning to read more. I haven't read any of his World War II stuff because it's just not really the genre that I'm interested in reading. I have read one of his World War II spy novels, which was really good. But yeah. Okay, so the next one on the list is Game of Thrones. So I read this whole series and it was really good. Obviously, so many people out there love this book. However, this first one really sticks with me. It stands out in my mind as a book that really genuinely shocked me. When I heard the show was coming out, I started reading the books. And I actually never ended up watching the show. I just read the books, but I read this and I didn't know anything about Game of Thrones other than it was like a fantasy thing, and I absolutely loved it. This book like blew my mind, and so it really stands out to me as like one of my favorite books. And it sort of falls into that category of like low fantasy, where you get that like medieval world and a lot of things going on, but like almost no magic. Like there is talk of dragons, obviously, and there are the, you know, White Walkers like later on, but in this first novel you essentially get medieval fiction. And I know that George R.R. Martin based a lot of the book on things that happened in history, or that was like his inspiration, so it makes sense. But I think that's a big reason why I like this book, is because of the low fantasy sort of aspect of it. And it, you know, I mean, twists and turns all over the place. The ending is insane. I remember after I finished this book, I went over to my friend's house, who she loves like the same sort of books as me for the most part. She likes more of like, she's more into the fantasy end of it, not as much in the medieval end. But I remember going to her house and we like sat on her porch and drank ciders, and I basically just told her the whole plot of this book because I had just finished it and I was like, oh my god, it's insane, you have to read this book. I'm not sure if she ever did actually, but I just remember being like, you have to read this is so good. And so yeah, definitely one of my all-times. I'm actually considering rereading it just because I've never reread it. I read it the one time and it just always like stuck in my brain, so I might reread it. However, I'm a little bit of a slow reader, so usually when I think about rereading things, I'm like, I'll just move on to something else. But this one would be worth it, so Game of Thrones. Okay, so the next book on the list I feel like is a book that is probably a lot of people's favorites. Lord of the Rings. Actually, specifically Fellowship. I love The Hobbit, I love the whole series, but Fellowship I feel like is the best of the trilogy, and you find that with a lot of things. Like the first one is always the best. You know, it's like the beginning, where you find out what the conflict is going to be, and it's just very intriguing to see that build up as they venture out into the world. But I am absolutely obsessed with Lord of the Rings. I watched the movies when they came out in theaters when I was like 10 years old, and so I am just a huge fan. I have a Hobbit hole tattoo. Something about it just really struck my brain in like a really crazy way when I was a child and never left. And so I am obsessed with Lord of the Rings, and I recently reread The Hobbit and Fellowship, and I am always telling myself that I'm gonna read Two Towers and Return of the King again, but I never do. I recently bought the box set of all four of them, and I got through these two and I was like, okay, I'm gonna keep going. And then I just put it down and started reading other things because I have like the longest TBR pile in the history of humans. So I figured I should move on, but I do want to reread them again at some point. But Fellowship is just so good, and I'm sure that there are a million people who would tell you that, and this book would be in their list as well. It's not a big surprise, it just gives you an idea of the things that I love. I don't read a lot of like epic fantasy things like Lord of the Rings. I guess when you think about it, it might just be like my obsession with Lord of the Rings that like makes me interested in reading these books. But it's definitely on the list, and I would recommend it to anybody. Okay, so the next book on the list sort of falls under the same sort of dynamics as Game of Thrones for me, and that is Name of the Wind. This book really struck me. I remember a couple of people recommending it to me and not reading it for a while. I don't know why, it just didn't stand out to me that much. Like when I looked at it or like read the back, just like, yeah, okay, maybe. And then I read it and I was like, oh man, like this is a great book. I know there's a lot of people out there that would tell you, you know, don't, or wouldn't recommend it or tell you not to read it because of how long it is taking Rothfuss to write the last book in the trilogy. But this is a really good book, and Wise Man's Fear is really good as well. The second one, if the third one doesn't come out, you know, obviously that would be a shame. We're all like waiting for that. I'm sure it will eventually. I don't know what it'll be like. The first two books sort of traverse such a short period of time. I really can't imagine that the third one would sum everything up. So who knows what that will end up to be. But despite that, I'm still recommending Name of the Wind because it is a perfect example of a low fantasy book where you get great characters and a great setting, and there's not, you know, all of this highfalutin like throwing fireballs and casting spells and all this shit. Like, I know a lot of people are looking for that and want that sort of thing. It's just not for me. It just kind of pulls me out of it. And especially the sort of urban fantasy books that are like set now and people are running around and casting spells and all. I know that people love that, and I can see why. Like, I understand, I love fantasy, so like I can understand why people like that, but it's just not really for me. And but I do love low fantasy, and this is a great example of that, where there is magic and it feels like a magical world, and there are sort of fantasy things going on, but it's not like hitting you over the head, and the characters are really well written, and so I'm still recommending Name of the Wind. I don't care what anybody says. It's really good. Okay, so the last book on my top 5 all-time favorite books is Circe. This book by Madeline Miller. I don't know where I'm going with that. Nothing. This is a fantastic book. This is a book that is based on myth, Greek myth, and it's amazing. I actually was surprised. I went and looked at the reviews for it, like on Amazon and other places, and it didn't seem like it had that great of reviews, but it is genuinely really good. Maybe it's just not for some people, I don't know, but it's very poetic. The way it's written is absolutely beautiful, and it takes place over like thousands of years. It's been a while since I read it, so I don't remember exactly, but it spans like a super long time, and it sort of just follows this woman's life, where she's like a goddess, her life, and it's not like, there are things going on, obviously. It's not like these huge crazy adventures or anything like that. A lot of that is like beautiful descriptions of like small moments, and it's really almost like dreamlike, and it's beautiful. It's amazing. I read Song of Achilles as well, which is really good. I love anything like Greek myth, ancient Greece, like anything. I'm super into that. But Song of Achilles, I don't know if I've like read too many things about Troy or what, but like it didn't strike me in the same way. Like, it was a great book, and you know, I would recommend it to anyone who's like interested in anything like ancient Greek or whatever, but I think this one was sort of leagues beyond it as far as like the writing style and the storytelling, and I don't know, it's just like really beautiful, and I like would recommend this to somebody just like on a whim. I remember like my friend asking me like, oh, like I'm looking for a book to read, and I was like, Cersei, read it, like you have to read it, and she was blown away by it. But if you know, if you don't like fantasy, you don't like historical fiction, you don't whatever, this is still for you. Obviously it's not any of those things really, but it's just really well written, really good, and I'm like constantly waiting for Madeline Miller to come out with a new thing because I'm very excited to see like what it would be. And so yeah, Cersei is definitely on my top 5. Alright, so now we're gonna move on to my top 5 of the year. So just like the first list, these books are not in any specific order just because I have a very hard time, like I had a hard time even picking out my top 5 all-time books. Like I have a very hard time ordering them specifically and like, oh well, I liked this one a little more than that one. Like I just really liked them, it's just what it is. So I'll start with Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb. I honestly think, although I didn't put a Robin Hobb book on my top all-time favorites, I honestly think she's one of the best fantasy writers that's like ever lived. Like I honestly think her Assassins trilogy is absolutely amazing, and I recommend it to anyone and everyone who likes anything fantasy. Her character writing is outstanding, and her world building is like flawless. It's like she didn't build this world, it just exists and she's just telling you about it, and it comes across so seamless and easy, and yet it's so in depth, and the characters are just so well written. And I remember I read Ship of Magic earlier this year. I had gone out to visit my brother halfway across the country, and my flight was like 6 hours and I was traveling all day, and I got to his house, I was absolutely exhausted. It was like 2 a.m. and I still wouldn't go to bed before reading like 30 pages of this because I was just like obsessed with it, and I was reading every day, any chance that I got, and it takes me a long time. Like, I'm not a super fast reader. I love to read, but I don't read super fast, and so a book this size usually takes me, you know, at least like a month, and I think I don't know how long it took me, but I remember thinking it was really fast. Like, I read this so quickly, and I honestly think, like, I started with the Assassins trilogy from a recommendation of, my boyfriend actually told me to read it. He loved them, and while I do think it's an amazing series, I think this one sort of grabbed me more right off the bat. Like, it had a better hook, and despite sort of talking about how I am not into pirates, like I'm not into like the pirate theme, I wasn't sure if I was going to want to read a book that was like about boats, essentially, like sailing and being on boats. I absolutely loved it. It was incredible, and there's a lot more fantasy in this book than the ones I'd mentioned before, like my top 5 list. This one is very, like, there's like sentient ships and sort of like magic trinkets and like that's, and like curses and weird things going on with the land. So, but the way it's written is just sort of amazing. I feel like I said that like 19 times, so I'm sorry, but if you're looking to get into Robin Hobb, this book doesn't, supposedly this trilogy doesn't really relate to the other books that she's written, whereas like the rest of them kind of connect. So if you're looking to get into it but you're not sure you want to read this whole elaborate, in-depth like series, pick up these ones first. It is a trilogy, obviously, and they're pretty long, but like if you want something unrelated to her other things, it's this one. Okay, so the next book that is on my top 5 of the year is Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman, I believe is how you say that. This book is weird. It's very crazy. I bought this book after reading about it like it just sort of popped up on Amazon as like recommended for you, or I was like looking for books and this one sounded really good, and so I purchased it. But I didn't read it. I ended up reading it, but so I kept reading like the first couple of pages, and it's like very gritty, and I was like, I don't know if this is for me. The vibe, I wasn't sure. And then there was a sale on, I have a couple of like audiobook apps. One is Audible, one is Chirp. One of them was like having a sale on this book specifically, and I was like, you know what, maybe I'll enjoy like listening to it, because sometimes if there are books that like I can't get through physically reading, if I listen to it as an audiobook, that's more enjoyable. So I got it as an audiobook and I listened to it, and I was sort of stunned by it, because the first couple of pages is not what it ends up to be at all, which, like, I mean, I'm sure you could say that for a lot of books, but I feel like the tone sort of put me off at first, but then the story itself is really incredible, and it's it sort of deals with like angels and demons and prophets and sort of like religious symbolism. It's also sort of poetic in a dark way, and there's a character that's sort of like Joan of Arc, and she's like a little girl, and she's with this knight, and it's very hard to explain, but it's really good, and I do kind of want to now reread it again as like the physical copy, because sometimes you lose things when you're, I listen to audiobooks when I'm at work, so sometimes like I don't quite get everything maybe as I should. When I read, I tend to read a sentence and then read it again, and sometimes I go back and like start the paragraph over just to absorb everything, and I obviously didn't get the chance to do that with this, but this is definitely the type of book that you would want to do that, and so I'm considering rereading it, the physical copy. I mean, I have it. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this to anybody who likes that sort of like almost like dreamlike sort of state. It's really cool. It's unique. It's very unique. So yeah, Between Two Fires. Okay, so the last 3 books on my list I don't have the physical copy of. I listen to them as audiobooks, so I will put a little image up here of the book cover. So the next book in my list is called The Daughter of the Moon Goddess. This is a book that is about, I believe it's based on Chinese myth, and it is very like fantasy. Obviously it's mythical, and it's really unique. I don't think I've ever, I got it because I was interested in hearing like what Chinese myth was like, because obviously, I've read a lot of Greek mythology, a little bit of like Celtic mythology, but I'd never read anything that was Chinese, so I was super interested to see what that was like. And it was a beautiful, beautiful novel. It was it sort of has that dreamlike quality as well. It's sort of like poetic in the way that it's written, and the characters are really intriguing, and even though it is, it's hyper fantasy, and I feel like, okay, so I have a couple of modes where it's like I like very low fantasy or like hyper fantasy and no in between. I don't know if this makes sense, but so like I think that's specifically why I don't like the urban fantasy, because if it's just like modern life plus fireballs or spells or whatever, like it takes me out of it. I'm not interested. But if it is like a totally separate fantasy world where I can sort of imagine this is just like a totally separate thing from our reality, then that's fine. Or it's like low fantasy where it's like I can picture it being in our world because it's so sort of minute. So that being said, this book is essentially like this the main character is the daughter of a goddess who has been like banished to the moon, and then she comes back to Earth to try to win her mother's freedom. And the whole thing just sort of follows her as she goes on this quest to free her mother from being imprisoned. And it's amazing and it's great, and I really enjoyed it. Like, I knew I would, or I had an idea that I would like it because of its themes and the fact that it was like based in myth, but I liked it way more than I thought I would, and definitely recommend it. So the next book on my list for the year is a book that a lot of people know and love. It's probably not going to come as a surprise to anyone. It is The Last Unicorn. This book was actually sort of shocking to me in a weird way, because it deals with some dark themes and doesn't really seem like a children's novel at all. Like, I can see how it became like, oh, like for children or whatever, and especially, you know, once the cartoon was made and all that. But I mean, there is like an interaction right at the beginning. The unicorn talks to like I think it's a butterfly, and the butterfly is like shouting all of this metaphoric like dark stuff, and I just remember reading, like, or I listened to it, listening to it and being like shocked that this was The Last Unicorn. It just wasn't what I imagined, but it was very interesting and very different from other like fantasy novels that are aimed at young adults. So I don't know, I don't really have anything else to say. I think everyone has heard of The Last Unicorn and knows it really well, and I'm not going to say anything like new and unique. Actually, speaking of Patrick Rothfuss, the version that I listened to, he did a foreword for it, and he literally says, like right at the beginning, he's like, I'm not going to say anything new that you haven't already heard about this book. It's amazing, I love it. And then goes on to write like 5 pages about about the book. Just like, I don't want to be that person who's like, I have nothing to say, and then you talk for like 45 minutes. So all I'm going to say is that it's great, and if you haven't read it, you should read it, because it's definitely an experience, and especially if you like fantasy, you'll love it. And that's it. The Last Unicorn. Okay, so the last book on my list for the year is The Autumn Throne by Elizabeth Chadwick. This is the last book in a series about Eleanor of Aquitaine, or Eleanor, however you want to say it. It's a medieval fiction book about a real woman who was Queen of England, and it's really well done, I think. The series talks about her life basically from the time, I think she's like between like 12 and 14, up until she dies when she's like in her 80s, and it goes through you know, marrying 2 different people who end up king, first the King of France and then the King of England. Goes through having, you know, all of her children, all of her travels, and it's definitely one of those books that's like about character. So if you are super plot driven in the books that you like, maybe it's not for you, but it's really good, and it's just right deep in that medieval fiction stuff that I love. But this ends the series, and I thought it was funny because I was saying to my boyfriend that, like, when I'm reading these books, I really want to know, like, oh god, what happens to her? What happens next? And I'm always tempted to look at Wikipedia or, like, just Google what happened, and it's like, history is spoilers. So I guess if you learned your history really well, you already know what's going to happen. But I didn't, I guess. Nobody ever really taught us that much about medieval history in school, so I have no idea what's coming. But it was just really great. It was nice to see, like, how her life ended up, and the way that everything turned out, and it was just a really nice cap on the trilogy as a whole. Sometimes you read a trilogy and you get to the very end and you're just sort of like, okay, I guess, like, whatever, I guess that's it. But this was pretty satisfying just to see it all the way through, and, you know, it sort of answers all of your questions, and you see, like, all the way up until the end of her life, and, I don't know, I just really liked it, and I would definitely recommend that trilogy to anybody who likes medieval fiction. Alright, so those are my lists. Hopefully you like some of these books as well, and we can read together in the future and talk about books. I hope you have a better idea of, like, my reading preferences now, and I'll be back very soon to talk about more books. I have a series planned where I talk about medieval romance. So there are, you know, when I'm looking for medieval books, as I'm often doing, a lot of medieval fiction is romance, which, like, I can sort of understand the idea of, like, chivalry and that sort of thing. And I know, like, romance books are really popular right now. I see them everywhere, all over, like, TikTok, or not TikTok, YouTube, and, you know, everywhere else. And so I thought that I would talk about some medieval romance books. I will share, once I get them all in from the mail, I will, you know, do a book haul video or whatever, and then in the future talk about some medieval romance. I'm very excited. Romance is not, like, a genre that I have ever really read much of, but I'm definitely interested in it, and I will see how that goes. And so I will look forward to talking to you again very soon.